afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of work, in today's lecture we are going to talk about the informal sector. This is a part of the entire understanding of how we look into the economy, and this kind of goes into the understanding of how we have been bifurcating the economy into various categories: formal, informal, organized, unorganized, agrarian, industrial. So how do we look into this concept of informal? So first we will try to understand how this term comes into the use in academic, in the development sector, and how this becomes very significant as terms of looking at it as a problem of urbanization. But then we will see how people, especially thinkers looking into the understanding of globalization, neoliberalization, looks into informal sector not as a problem but as a solution that the neoliberal found for themselves, and that is the reason why there is a kind of a divide between, and there is a kind of widening of the gap between those who are and it's a very small percentage who are at the higher level skilled workers, formal workers, and the larger percentage of the workers are being pushed to the margin. So let us first try to understand what is the informal sector. So we kind of not go into this whole idea that informal economy or informal sector is something that is new with say the change capitalism or coming of globalization. It was always a part of society, and it is as old as humankind. So though it is kind of becoming more profound, and it has become more kind of affecting or impacting the life of a larger population, and therefore it becomes important to understand the sector or economy. So historically most of the employment business, they were conducted informally, until and unless we have these regulations coming in. And basically if you kind of look into it, the entire regulation of workplace kind of comes in with the colonial rule, where say a lot of rules regulated to the workers or to Factory Act were kind of made, and that is where we kind of see in the distinction that there is a sector which is regulated and there is one which is kind of outside regulation. So it is indeed kind of an kind of a administrative construct, and this because it only kind of captured a part of the workers or the economy, and therefore we kind of start having a distinction between the formal and the informal, and therefore it all kind of goes along together, and we see how dualism becomes very significant. Different categories kind of emerges. On one we had, say, those are regulated, on the other side were those which were not regulated, and here regulated means they were under the government regulation. So then when they were only those that registered became regulated, and those which were unregistered would be left as irregulated or outside the purview of regulation. So we kind of have these categories of, say, regulated, unregulated, or we have registered, unregistered companies, organized, unorganized, and so on and so forth. So how do we kind of make sense of this term informal? So 1970 was the first time where the British anthropologist Keith Hart, he had used this term for the first time, and this was specifically to refer to economic activities of migrant from northern Ghana in the capital of city Accra. Now we look into the background of how this study comes in is that 1970 was also a period of industrialization, and you have a large scale migration of individual, and here by and large it were working men who moved from agrarian sectors to industrial sector in search of job. So these migrants, they came in with a kind of an expectation of improving their status by getting a kind of a job. So the term that was used for those who are coming in from agrarian sector to get observed into the urban sector, the term informal was used. Now once this comes in, this term comes in from the academics, it was taken up by the International Labour Organization, and the kind of it became very popular, and most of the studies started referring to the people. So it was kind of anybody walking through the city, and what would appear was say a large number of migrant workers who were unskilled, who were kind of sometime in employment, sometime not employment. So this term started being used, and again, what kind of happens was that when we start using this term, is kind of, it was used for traditional sector. So why was it used to traditional sector? Because there is a kind of a flow. So these are the people who are coming from agrarian, and again larger dichotomy was between the tradition and modernity. So industry, urban, city, these were all clubbed into the category of modern, and those who were say in the rural areas, those who were doing agricultural activity, they were termed as tradition. So these dichotomies kind of were used to kind of bifurcate the economy, and we'll see when we kind of try to critique the way in which informal sector has been understood, that it is kind of does not help us to have a holistic understanding of the economy. The moment we kind of start doing this distinction between one category versus the other, what we tend to negate is the idea that what could be found in the other as could be overlap. So these are not kind of very separate or water kind compartment, and there could be a lot of overflow from one to the other. So why do we need to study informal economy? And before we go into the say theoretical understanding of sociology of work and academic work, we saw in the pandemic in the past few months when a large number of workers who were migrants specifically across the globe, they were in a kind of a catch situation where they did not kind of even have that leisure to kind of work from home, and yet they did not have the means to kind of go back to the place. So this is a time, and it was a large population which was all over the media, and kind of started kind of thinking, why is this population kind of undergoing so much of precarity or so much of suffering? So it is a time where we need to understand that the segment of informal economy is large. It's kind of increasing every time. So 2 million people, and that's more than 61% of the world's employed population, they are living in the informal. And this is again a report from the ILO. They are engaged, and now it's not that they are only in the so-called traditional occupation. They are in the traditional occupation, they are in the modern economic activities, and in almost all kind of branches we find informal economy, labor, whether we talk about artisans, craft production, or we talk about factory production, or we talk about academics. Everywhere, every industry, a large segment of the workers are informal. So, and we have seen in the recent past that there is a trend within the public sector to go for contractual workers. And contractual workers, in a way, belongs to that category of informal labor. Why? Because they are outside the state protection, they are outside state regulation. So we find it all over. So in no industry where we can't find this informal, it's kind of exaggerated. The numbers are increasing, and it's not only that they are kind of insignificant. Yes, they was for a kind number of time in the beginning invisible because data was not available, but then they contribute significantly. Even the fact that they are working from home or they are kind of invisible. Say for instance, when we have this factory production, and number of informal workers are not producing in the factory. They are working from their home. And there's a number of subcontractors, contractors who could be in between the employer and the employee. But yet their production is part of the factory production. So they are contributing to the economy in around the world. It's not only in the context of India, but all over we know that there is a large percentage of production of goods and services are coming from the informal workers. But the problem is that though the number is increasing and we find them in almost every industry or we find them in every field, their conditions are deteriorating. So when we look into the livelihood or we look into the kind of wage or we look into the other facilities which are, or we look into the security safety nets, they are kind of not being talked about, or it is kind of very miserable, and that is why we use the term kind of Guy Standing has used the term precarious workers. So they are kind of very marginalized, on the margin, without protection, almost living in poverty. And especially when we talk about these informal workers in the urban setup, we see they are almost on the margin of the city. They are on the bottom of the rank, and they kind of you don't have a fixed employment, and yet you have to have a livelihood. So you need to sell your labor power, and the more you sell your labor power, the more the capacity to sustain yourself in the city. And therefore there are scholars who could look into this as a modern form of slavery. So you have selling your labor power in order to kind of sustain. So they, when we look into the features of informal workers, we'll see that even the job is not regular, and we kind of see all around, especially in urban areas like Delhi, we see an individual was kind of, say, doing in one particular kind of work. The next month you see him selling vegetable, becoming a vendor, the next month. So it's a frequent change. And in this transition from one job to other, there are periods when they are unemployed. So it's not kind of a permanent worker status. They are kind of changing their job, and many a time the wage that they get are fluctuating. They might be getting a high wage, they might kind of end up getting a low wage. So there is a kind of a low income group, and there is absence of labor contract. Rather, we kind of there's a lot of study which looks into how contractor and subcontractor, they kind of appropriate the labor and kind of not only appropriates the labor of the worker, but they appropriate the profit that would actually accrue to the workers. And because you have this contractors, subcontractors coming in between the employer and the employee, the collective bargaining or the direct relation between the employer and employee has got affected, and therefore organized activity within the informal sector is negligible. So this is the kind of an understanding of the context in which the term informal work started being used within the academics and development sector. When we look into the work of Boeck, whose work is Homo Socialis, he was referring to the working mass. And basically, again, what we need to keep in mind is that this informal, when we are talking about the dichotomies in terms of tradition, modernity, agrarian, industrial, there's another set which is the developed and the developing. So most of the time, these developing countries were the countries, or we could also say they were kind of, if we don't say developing, they were the developed and the underdeveloped. So the underdeveloped were the countries where you could find a larger, and this was also a part of the entire way in which the economy was getting restructured. So the restructuring of economy in terms of where outsourcing of production started, and you wanted cheap labor, and you also had a kind of a reserve army of labor where the population was high, so people were ready to work and at a cheaper rate. So much of this kind of opening up of the economy, outsourcing of production, further increased the use of informal worker, and therefore it kind of becomes not a push to development, but it becomes a kind of a hurdle or restraint to the development of developing or underdeveloped countries. And this distinction between agriculture and industry was kind of replaced, so earlier with this industrialization, and then we move towards say urbanization and information society. With this change in terms, we had this dichotomy of the city versus the agrarian, or we were kind of looking into city and industrial, and therefore village and agricultural became static and diametrically opposed. Now, when we look into all this dichotomy, what we can talk about is how economic dualism led to the construction of the term called informal. Now, what are these debates about? These, and especially when we talk about post-independent era, or we talk about the 50s, 60s, we see that they are major economic dualism, something like we are already talked about in terms of agriculture versus industry, village versus town, and develop versus developing. So these dualism, and there was a kind of, we look into try to understand Indian society, there was a kind of an Orientalist bias in the sense that they were looking at the underdeveloped countries or developing countries from the perspective of the developed. So whereas town was supposed to be a part of the West, village was attributed to the East. So that kind of a dualism led to the consideration of the idea that city is the place from where informal worker or it is the place, or it is the location of the informal worker. So again we start to kind of having this understanding that agriculture would be all formal employment, and in the urban area would be informal workers, whereas this is kind of not a very neat mapping that we see in actual reality. It kind of is based on the idea that yes, people were moving from agricultural rural area to the city for industrial employment, but that does not imply that in agrarian area you will not find informal workers, or on the contrary, urban areas you will not find formal employment. So these there is kind of a very difficult mapping between this economic dualism which is done. Now the entire debate of the informal sector can be placed in the framework of the transition from agrarian to industry. So the transition from agriculture to industry was kind of not smooth, because not everybody who came to the city was able to get employment. They came up with hope, lot of aspiration, and since they are coming in from say rural area without education, without skills, they were not, all of them were not absorbed. So only those who kind of had say semi-skilled or some kind of skill were able to get employment. A larger mass was left unemployed, and this was the mass in the city which gave the impression that city was kind of breeding ground for informal workers. And this entire section which was coming in from rural area to the cities were the ones who were unorganized. They were unprotected in the urban towns, and as I already said, that since they are kind of, they were on transit, they were moving, and even from one place to the other in search of employment, even the employment was changing. So they were invisible, and therefore kind of no correct estimate of the size of this sector was kind of increased. So what we talk about is that informal sector is the outcome of the process of formalization. When formalization starts happening, that is when rules, policies starts becoming, the policies of protections, policies of regulation starts happening, then the others who are not regulated would lead to the formation of informal sector. So the formalization was kind of taken for granted, and there was an exodus of surplus labor from agrarian rural kind of the second half of the 20th century. This rate of migration was very high, and there was almost a kind of a flooding in cities of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and they were kind of trying to gain access to formal sectoral employment, and only few of them could penetrate. And as we know, there's a lot of red tapeism, and there's a lot of corrupt practices, and even though it's a kind of a formal sector, there are a lot of primordial ties that works, there are a lot of other practices which work. So a large number of them were not able to get employment into the formal setup, and therefore, so you had this formalization as one category of workers being given the production. There's a rush from the other agrarian sector to become formalized, leads to the exclusion of a number of workers who then form the informal sector. So this informal sector was discovered or constructed in the 1960s or we can say early 1970s, and it was always in terms of opposition. So it was the larger understanding was that what was not to be found in the formal was informal. So from the very beginning we see, from the origin we see, if those sectors which were not regulated, that was not registered, fall into the informal. So there was a kind of an understanding of informal in comparison or in contrast to the formal sector. And whatever terms and privilege the formal sector employed was assumed to be absent in the informal sector. And informal labor relations became defined in contrast to the formal sector. So the economic dualism is kind of becomes the background for understanding for informal sector. So when we look into what is formal and what is informal, will help us to understand how the informal is understood in contrast to the formal. So when we talk about the formal sector, what do we understand? It has, obviously the first thing is that it is an organized system of employment, because there are certain rules, employment rules, and when one gets recruitment, you sign a contract and certain agreement, terms and conditions are laid down, and the wage earning is settled. The second is it has a standardized relation between employer and the employee. So almost there is a one-to-one direct relation between the employer and the employees. There are no mediators, there are no contractors and subcontractors in between. So in case there is a kind of a breach of contract or any terms and conditions are not met, the employer can directly approach the employee. So both the sides have kind of their rules. So you are expected to work according to fixed hours and receive fixed salary, that is wage earning, according to the skill and hour of work that is done. And in addition to the wage, you also get the perks and incentives. When we look into the informal sector, the first is that when we look into the informal sector, they are not organized, you know. So when we look into the fact that when we talk about organized, what does it imply? It implies that the workers are entitled to number of benefits, your leave, your saving, loans, social security measures, all of this are protected. The next feature of formal sector is that the employees are covered under all kind of health benefit, life insurance benefit, pension, gratuity, these all come under the social security benefit. If we look into the informal sector, in contrast to the first, that is the formal sector has a set of written rules and agreement, it is completely absent. You know, it does not have any rules. Most of the employment in the informal sector is by mouth. You say that okay, you work for this many hours and you will get so much of work for the work that you done. You never write a contract or you never kind of enter into an agreement. So it is merely a verbal understanding between the two. And what is also important is that this verbal agreement is sometime kind of bypass. So you have the contractor entering into an agreement with the employer, the main employer, and then this employer contractor creates his or her own sets of idea and gives it to the next in the entire chain. So there could be a change in the original understanding and the one that is passed on to the worker. The next is that there is no fixed hours. They could work beyond 14 hours, there is no question of overtime payment, and no fixed wage. Even for the same nature of work, the payment will vary from worker to worker. And this is entirely, most of the time, because the workers are directly related to the contractor or subcontractor. It is these subcontractors and subcontractors, or many a time if you don't even have, the terms wages are kind of not decided from one central part. It is varies from individual to individual. So therefore the work organization is unorganized, congested, hygienic, and we kind of use different terms. There was no sense of looking into the condition under which they are working. There is no collective bargaining. Most of them are at the lower level, and therefore they are in the poverty. There is no sense of social protection schemes, and obviously because the wage is so low that they cannot even meet their everyday living, so it is kind of difficult for them to look into savings. So when we look into this informal sector, and this is again something which comes in terms of comprehending informal sector. We refer to the 17th International Conference of Labour Statisticians, and this was in 2003, which spelled out the specific categories, because it's kind of a very heterogeneous category. So there's a lot of attempt to make it categorize, classify these workers. So the first is own account workers, self-employment with no employee, they're doing their own work. The second is employers, self-employed with employees. So you're doing your work at your pace, at your convenience, but you have to give in the product to the employer. And the employers are mostly family workers who work irrespective of type of the enterprise. So the employees holding informal jobs are subjected to national labor legislation and income taxation. And this is kind of quite problematic, that they don't have any kind of protection. But when it comes to in terms of their wage or in terms of their deductions of income, then the reference is to the national legislations. So they suffer from social protections and entitlement to certain employment benefits. Their own account workers engaged in production of goods exclusively use the product in their own household. So if they are a family-based household, business household, then it is the family members are working and it is kind of consumed within that household. Employment in the informal is the sum total of employment in the informal sector and the household sector. So this distinction is not kind of very clear. When we look into the features, and which I have already kind of been talking about, the first which is of most important concern is wage payment is not on time but on piece rate. So a method, each number of piece that you make, you will be paid for it, and this leads to kind of over and under payment. Obviously they are working for long hours, and underemployment is kind of not studied, but this is a kind of important features in the informal sector. So there is no overhead allowance or social benefit being given. There is a lack of collective agency and clear preference for those who hire labor power to procure it on the basis of self-employment. We'll be looking into it when we talk about how the understanding of employment modality, that it is in terms of self-employment, which is very important. So what drives informality? Why do we see the numbers increasing? Number one is poverty and social exclusion. And obviously because the agrarian sector was not doing well, if post-independent India, agrarian sector was not doing very well, there was a lot of increase in poverty, so people shifted to, and city and urban kind of is a pull factor, they pull workers to it, but city cannot provide employment to all of them. Then there is also in terms of economic restructuring that we have talked about, global financial crisis, lack of regulation. When we talk about regulation, we see a change of the state role. This change is this state is no longer kind of protecting or it is kind of moving more towards in terms of privatization and protecting the market. So we kind of workers, it is a lack of employment, it is kind of lack of social employment. For business, it's kind of an advantage because they can save the cost of production. When we look into all of this of how the concept has been talked about, we'll see how Jan Bremen would critique this concept and lead to a redefinition of the concept of informal worker. So we will try to then understand informal workers in terms of questioning of understanding in term as opposition to the formal labor. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.